The mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. A process that cannot be understood by stopping it. We must move with the flow of the process. We must join it.
Welcome to episode 37 of the Filmumentaries podcast. It's Jamie Benning here talking to you, sat here in my still suit in my Fremen tent. A little clue there as to what the podcast is this week. So if you're new to the podcast, please go back and check out the other 36 previous episodes. Last time out, I spoke to Sean Barton, editor of Quadrophenia, Jagged Edge, and Return of the Jedi. A very nice man. Had a good couple of hours chatting with him, and I appreciate your feedback. Those of you that have listened to that, yeah, it was a fun one to do. If you're a regular listener, thanks for joining me again. And if you're a patron on Patreon, patreon.com/Jamie Benning, thanks so much for your continued support. It really does mean so much to me. And there are now 68 of you. I've recently changed the payment model from per creation to monthly, just so it's a simpler amount. I did have a couple of months there where I put in 3 episodes in 1 month. It was an oversight. And then 1 month where I did 1 episode. I just happened to miss my deadlines there. So I've put in a monthly amount. I still aim to do 2 podcasts per month. Obviously, that depends on if I can get the guests in time, but 2 is my aim. So it means I'm earning about half as much as I was. So if you are already a patron, please do remember to amend your monthly payment to make sure it's the amount that you want to give. I noticed that some of you have already done that. Thank you very much. So if you do want to help me by offering just $1 per month, that's $12 per year for hopefully 24 podcasts. And I'm an independent podcaster. It's just me. And it is work, albeit work that I genuinely love. You can find out all the details on patreon.com/Jamie Benning. As I said, I've added several tiers to my Patreon page recently, and which will get varying degrees of benefits. Patreon have also recently started a merchandise service for patrons who pay $20 per month. I know that's a lot. I do have one of you that's done that, amazingly, but you'll get a poster, you'll get a sticker, you'll get a mug, and some other stuff. So if you, dependent on how long you stick with me. But I figured, there might be a rich, generous potential patron out there. So do visit the site and check out what you can get on those tiers. And yeah, appreciate your support in any way. If you can't support me financially, then just retweet, just share, just tell people about the podcast. Let's get it out there. Us independent podcasts are being buried by the big corporations at the moment, and any help is gratefully received. Enough of that anyway. So for this episode, number 37, November 2021, I have a real treat. You will not have failed to have noticed that Denis Villeneuve's Dune has finally arrived after many delays. Thank you, COVID. Back on episode 16, I interviewed the sound designer Mark Mangini about his career and also his work on Blade Runner 2049, Denis' previous film. We stayed in touch, and I asked if he'd be willing to come back and talk about his work on Dune. He then introduced me to his colleague and collaborator, Theo Green, also a sound designer and composer, and we set a date to talk all about Dune. So this is the first time I've done a podcast about a new movie, and it was quite a buzz, actually. So I'll be doing this from time to time, but very cool to think my little podcast is all about the biggest film in cinemas at the moment. Just so you know, Mark is the American voice that you'll hear. Theo is the British voice. We did have some technical difficulties at the beginning, which I've left in because if I cut them out, it wouldn't make much sense as we refer back to it a couple of times later on in the conversation. And, this is a warts and all kind of podcast, so you'll hear Theo's young family in the background at times, but that's all part of the rich oral tapestry of this sound design episode. So here's my conversation all about the sound design of Dune with Mark Mangini and Theo Green. And I'll be back as usual at the end for a bit more jabbering on. I wanted to say to you guys that I loved the film. I sort of totally gave myself over to it in a way that I used to when I was a kid, where I would sit there kind of, open-mouthed, looking at the screen, dissolving into that world. And I'm sure your sound work had a huge contributing factor of that. I saw it once at the BFI IMAX, and then I saw it once in my local picture house with a notepad, desperately scrawling notes in the dark, hoping that the ink hadn't run out like 2 minutes into the movie. I was kind of blown away. It's the first time in a long time that I've seen a film that has kind of really absorbed me. And I just wanted to know, when you're working on a film like this, and I know we spoke previously, Mark, about your work with Denis, how important is it to achieve that result? How important is it to be engaged very early on in the process?
I think you will, as Theo and I walk through how we contributed to the film, it will become apparent that that is essential for us and our process with Denis. And that process on both films starts with Denis because of a very early yearning that goes back to his first days as a cinema student and a filmmaker, who saw that often on his early films, post-production was something that was rushed and allocated just a couple of weeks to the end of the filmmaking process. And he yearned for the day when he'd have more time for that. And I think he's now found his stride now that he's, well, not now that he's clearly a gifted and successful filmmaker. And now he's afforded the time and budgets that can indulge that desire to great effect. Theo, please finish that thought.
Denis has always said that, what he felt on from his early days of filmmaking was that he was getting to live with the images for a long period of time. He was, obviously, the images start their development with storyboarding and concept art maybe, but certainly as soon as...
Oh,
you dropped
Theo
out,
frozen.
Theo.
We lost you, Theo. I wonder if he's recording at his end.
I think he said he wasn't.
Oh dear. He's usually on his laptop, but he's got a new baby who's crying and feeding and playing and making all sorts of noise.
We lost you about a minute ago there, Theo. Sorry.
Oh dear. I'll try texting him. We usually don't have that. I've done 100 of these already with Theo, and this hasn't cropped up.
Ugh, frustrating. The response has been great, though, Mark, to the movie. I think it's really doing well here in Europe.
Oh, tremendous. Oh, I just heard that it crossed 300 million worldwide, which is a huge success for the studio.
Fantastic.
And as you can imagine, it made our day when it was announced that because of that, they were going to move forward with the part 2, which we're all very not anxious. We're all just really looking forward to working on because we had such a great experience on this one. Yeah. So no,
that's really good news.
He just said, "You go on, and I'll call from downstairs."
Okay, cool. All right. Sound informs so much of our world, and it's odd that the sound department isn't engaged more early on a movie. Do you hope that once the industry at large sees what you've achieved here with Dune, as well as your other work with Denis on Blade Runner, that it might bring about a situation where you do get engaged early more regularly on other movies?
That's definitely a long-range wish for Theo and I both. I don't think you can argue the success that this kind of sound approach has brought to those films. Mad Max certainly is included in that group. It started in pre-production, as did Blade Runner, as did Dune. And we can even point to, we'll tell a story at some point, I'll tell it or when Theo comes on, about how, in fact, bringing sound on this early might actually save money, even though on the surface of it, when you look at it, it looks like it's more expensive because a budget generally allocates X number of weeks for post-production sound, which is something in the name, post meaning after production, that it's not supposed to start till then. So anything that starts before that is considered some kind of extra or overage or
Like an indulgence of some sort.
That's exactly the word
Yeah.
that just came to my mind, is that they're indulging the filmmaker, but they wouldn't otherwise do it. And I think in this process, certainly, let's not put the cart in front of the horse. We aren't doing this to prove something. We're doing this to make a better movie. And along the way, we hope there's some knowledge and learning imparted in that process that shows sound is a really vital storytelling tool. And look at how much better it can make your film. And arguably, it shows in the box office.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's hope that's the case and it gets recognised for that. And I'm sure you'll be recognised when it comes to awards as well. I think it genuinely is one of the first films in a very, very long time where my first viewing, I always try and put away my critical eye and my filmmaking eye and ears. And I just was consumed by it. I really felt, part of that world. And as I say, that's the first time that's happened in a long time. I think the last time I was blown away by a movie from a sound point of view was probably Jurassic Park in 93 with Rydstrom and co, pulling off. Oh,
God, that's one of the greats.
Yeah, really
well,
cool.
You bring up a really vital topic that's worth talking about, and that is immersion. Immersion is a word you hear in the public square, but you also hear it in the sound community. And often immersion is confused or conflated with a technical aspect of a movie, meaning if you put in surrounds, you're immersed. It's conflated with the word surrounded. And I would argue, based on what you just said, that you were fully immersed in the sense that you were fully engaged and taken over by everything that you heard and saw. And that is certainly part of the modus operandi of both Theo and I, which is to immerse you with sound, not by doing it with using the surrounds, but by using sound that captivates you and hence immerses you. And I think that's a really important distinction.
Hey, Theo.
I am so sorry about that. I'm back.
No worries. And listen, if there's any crying babies in the background, I have
there will be.
A young family too, so it's not a problem.
It's all part of the atmosphere.
That's it. Yeah. So you, Theo, were just talking about that approach that Denny takes in engaging you guys early and allowing you to, create a wonderful movie like Dune.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for letting me rewind back to that. I was just saying that I think Denny has always felt that the images are something which he lives with, sometimes for months to a year, and the sound on his early films was something that really came in the last few weeks, and it just seemed like an imbalance for something that's meant to live, so dovetailed together. So yes, it was very much his idea and his persuasion that sounds should be developed alongside the images so that they become old friends, so that if there's something which has been sort of, after 6 months of listening to it, if it's starting to bug him, then great, we can look at replacing it. But there's probably nothing worse than being a filmmaker who has a whole layer of the film come in at the very last moment, only to have something bug him many years later. I wish we hadn't put that silly sound in there. So I think it was that idea of enabling us to get the sounds in front of him and in front of his editor from day one, really, literally. As the rushes come in, his editor Joe Walker would be working on those in concert with our sound.
Yeah, and I love the sounds going on in the background at the moment.
That's a festival. It's a sandwich of sound. Theo, apologies. I just wanted to add to the end of that because Jamie and I were discussing about how immersed he felt in the movie, and we talked a little bit about why. And one of the reasons why we are passionate about sound coming on so early, and as is Denis, is that it's very empowering for the filmmaker in this respect. By the time we get to final mix, Denis has virtually heard everything and he's signed off on it. It's empowering because at the final mix, we believe that's the time for the director to be making the really big meta decisions about a soundtrack. A director should not be in the trenches granularly wondering, I don't like that squeaky thing and I don't like that rumbly thing. They should be making the big decisions about, you know what, we're going to drive this scene with music. Let's pull effects and dialogue down, or let's make this a monumental feeling of being there, and let's not use the music cue here. Those are the big decisions that a director should be making, the narrative decisions that contribute to how you feel about a movie. And he's empowered to do that in this way of working because we've worked out all the sounds. Most mixes, most sound designers will tell you that a final mix is often a struggle to just get through the day to get to something that everyone can kind of live with. We aspire to something much greater than that because the filmmaker is empowered to really do their job as best as they can.
Yeah, you don't want to be in that position in the final mix of compromising on things at the final hour. Yeah. I often sort of wonder, putting myself in the position of your job, your sound design job and your sound supervisor job, I wonder if there are any easy wins that you've had on these big gigs like Blade Runner and Dune, where you've just plucked a sound and gone, that works perfectly. And also how many iterations you go through to come up with some of those amazing sounds as well. Like one of them I think of immediately is the voice, the Bene Gesserit voice. The way the kind of...
Well, that's one extreme. I'll let Theo jump in on that. But that's this extreme of took the longest.
When I heard that for the first time, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And there's that delay in the voice as well that kind of shortens over time as Paul's powers become more apparent. And I'd never heard anything like it. It felt like I was trying to describe it to my wife because she hasn't seen the movie. I described it as like anti-sound. It's not like you're just taking sound away. It's like you're going past zero and you're somehow going into the negative. How do you achieve a sound like that?
Yeah, so that was a very long process of building an idea in concert with Mark and Denis and Joe. And, it's that's the longest life cycle of any sound that we have in the movie, I think, and was in fact the very first thing that Denis flagged up to us as this is the most important thing to get right. So I don't know, hopefully we didn't cause too much anxiety by taking so long to develop, but I think that was, again, an example of why it's so good to have that length of time. It wasn't just the effect of the voice so much as the other things that we kind of learned that we could do with some of the elements of that voice along the way. So the sort of principal ingredients of that voice are, as you mentioned, sucking all of the atmospheres out of the room. As someone uses it, it's as if air disappears, as if the backgrounds disappear, and that just
the laws of physics change.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that you feel subconsciously. There's something uncanny that has happened, and you can't quite put your finger on it. But that's absolutely, I think a really vital part of it. The other thing is, we created this very deep bass resonance that is really an impact of the voice being used. It's a sense of how it affects your body, and that's something which really comes across well in the cinemas. More than on headphones, you literally feel the bass, vibrating your chest.
You dismissed my mother in her own house.
Come here, kneel.
And that was something which we'd sort of played with early on as an element that gives that sense of a force being used. That I won't go into all the techniques that we used to do that, but we sort of sent this as a separate layer to Joe Walker to play with Denis and sort of see how they like these elements. And early on, we also had a conversation, all of us, about how to honor the meaning of the voice, which really is the channeling of an ancient ancestral Bene Gesserit spirit or something. It's like he's tapped into something ancient that is deep in the DNA of the Bene Gesserit, and that thing that he's tapping into perhaps is the thing that is going to empower him to become the Kwisatz Haderach. It's the kind of we felt that what we needed to do just to experiment was to go and record a bunch of voices that sounded like what Mark and I imagined an ancient Bene Gesserit ancestor would be. We also had
a woman. I think it's important to say that we felt
female,
it was vital that it was a female voice.
Being an all-female sort of cult or whatever, it was important that it was, but that it had the sort of the gravitas and the gravel, as it were, of an older. They gave us the wonderful reference of Marianne Faithfull, and actually we contacted and recorded Marianne Faithfull, and she is one of a kind of coven of voices that we developed for that. The main voice that you hear is an actress called Jean Gilpin, who we did a ton of kind of both experimental recording early on and then, nailed down the exact things that we wanted from her later. But it was this idea that really the voice emanates from the user with their own voice, and then it kind of morphs into these ancient ancestral voices. However, it wasn't until right before we did the final mix that the formula of how to get across the idea that Paul is not proficient at using this voice, how to make it just, you experience him failing, but almost getting it in that very early scene. And then later we come to the same thing when he's a hostage with his mother in the Ornithopter. And at that point, first time round he gets it wrong and earns a punch in the chest, and second time he nails it. And it's that idea of how, we tried, what is that going to be? Just we do the same effect but a bit weaker, or there's a bit less bass or something. And it wasn't really until the last hour that Denis and Joe had this idea of, they've been manipulating the timeline visually so that, the voice is used, the person who it's been used on sees a flash forward of what it is that they're supposed to be doing, and then we cut back to them either doing it or not, if the voice has been successful or not. So as Joe had been playing around with the visual sort of timeline and sort of hopping around in time, and making kind of cutaways, I think in that early scene we see like a painting on the wall, we see just the light very slightly change on it. That's the point where we start kind of sucking the atmospheres out of the room. And the way that they came up with using our elements that we'd supplied was to slip the sync so that, a non-proficient user of the voice, you hear the kind of come out of their mouth on the lips. And then you cut to the character who they're using the voice on, and you hear the ancient voices kind of muddling around inside their head. All of these elements are there, they're just not quite in sync yet. And that was a really, really nice way of sort of showing both how the voice is intended to work. Like it gets inside your head, it muddles you up, it makes you think you've done something before you've done it. It's sort of, you get a sense of what the confusion that it creates in a victim is. And then luckily we get, a few scenes later, we get to show a very proficient user, Reverend Mother Mohayam uses it on Paul, and everything is just completely locked in sync. It's weaponized, and it's like, we feel that sense that there's absolutely no resistance to someone who's using it on that level. Yeah. So that was, we had the elements, we had little ideas, we had sort of a hint of where we were going to go. And we had a kind of chin-stroking nod from Denis, but not quite a "you've nailed it" until we got to those sort of final weeks.
Yeah, well, the phrase is, I deeply love this, isn't it? That's when you know.
We live for that.
The phrase, yeah.
I would add that not only did it take that amount of time to really finesse it to where Denis wanted it, but we certainly had an idea early on of what we didn't want to do. Our early experiments were what you would expect. Take Paul's voice and try to filter it somehow. This is a sound designer trope. You put it through a plugin of some kind, and now you've got some altered voice. But it quickly became apparent to Theo and I that it would be just that. It would be a kind of an amateurish ruse and no more.
I tried some very odd ideas that never made it as well. I mean, I don't know, Mark, if you remember, I recorded in an anechoic chamber in Dune.
Yeah, I remember that.
And we just tested it with an assistant who was working with us. But this idea of trying to make a recording that felt like it's inside someone's head. So I was using like bone conducting microphones all around the head, picking up like the bone resonance. And then the anechoic chamber, where you have absolutely no resonance at all. Everything is so uncannily dry and quiet. So the idea of sort of mixing a very dry, quiet recording of a voice with what you kind of hear in the bones, it was interesting, but it didn't convey that sense of a spell being cast, of a power being used, of an impact felt on the user. And those are all things that took all of us. I think at some point, Ron Bartlett, our dialogue and music re-recording mixer, Mark and I, everyone chipped in an idea like maybe this will work, and we played them all. And we were informed every time we did a playback with Denis and Joe. We had very clear guidance as to whether we were hitting something or not. It wasn't really until we suggested that thing of the ancient ancestral voices and started casting and recording them that they were like, yeah, there's something in that. And that then developed into a whole, a language which Mark and I were able to use. Denis started scripting new lines that Paul would hear in his visions.
It unlocked a whole narrative approach to the movie that no one had considered.
Yeah. Yeah, as you said before, Mark, it's using sound to tell the story. That's what it's there for, and it's super effective. Proper hairs standing up on the back of my neck and my arms and stuff. Yeah, really, really effective. When you take a scene like, there's a scene when Paul and Duncan come together and they have that kind of sort of intimate moment, that chat together, and he wants to join him on Arrakis, and I sort of felt the sound kind of being stripped back, and we just hear, like when he's talking about how he's seen him on Arrakis and he's seen him die, we hear the sounds of his fabric on his clothes and his armor, and you create an intimacy. You push back in somehow. I'm using my hands here like in a concertina motion, but I'd never really considered you'd be able to do that with sound. How do you go about achieving something like that?
I think that we need to hand that microphone over to Ron Bartlett and Doug Hemphill, are two of the finest re-recording mixers in the world, who think like actors and directors, not like sound people. And they intuitively understand the dramatic beats in a scene, and without even much, the kind of thing that I would sweat over, they instinctually react to a moment and say, yeah, let's focus in on that brotherhood between these two intimate friends. We don't need to hear that giant hangar bay that they're in. We just need to hear what it's like to be next to each other. That takes a great deal of intuition on the part of a sound mixer.
Generally speaking, Mark and I provide, there are occasionally times where we decide with the director that this is a moment where you're not going to hear any background sound. We don't give it to the re-recording mixes. There are certain moments where we design a certain kind of rack focus, but generally speaking, almost always we provide our mixers, Ron and Doug, with everything in focus, and it's a sort of a decision between all of us in the mix what to rack focus on at any particular moment, and that's the tools that they have in front of them with the reverbs and the faders. Really is that gives them the ability to bring down the backgrounds, focus in on the Foley, whatever it might be, and also to some extent we have decisions to make over dialogue, effects, music, which of those should be more prominent at any moment. But their ability to rack focus is I think is a phrase which they always use, which I think is so accurate. It's not just, they're not just doing it for effect, it's always how can we forward the story with every single one of those decisions.
I thought it was really interesting how sound makes you buy a scene, and one thing that I was struck by is those scenes with Leto and Paul up on the hills with the gravestones. That was shot without any sea there, right? That sea is added later, is that right?
That's a good question.
The bluffs. So yes, actually, I don't know how much that's been discussed elsewhere, but there is some reshooting there that was done on a different location. Originally, it was shot in a location on Norway, and they have integrated some of the sea and cliffs and backgrounds from Norway into a shoot that was done on another mountaintop without the sea. So, Denis never going to shoot something like that in a green screen and then put the backgrounds in later. It's always a case of get the nearest possible thing. And then, the VFX team led by Paul Lambert are specifically good at, choosing, something where the background is 98% what they wanted, or even flying a helicopter instead of an ornithopter, so that there's some real world visual reference that they can then build around rather than everything being created inside a computer. So, so those scenes, the sea was largely added later, I believe.
I would add that scene, again, speaking of rack focus, Doug Hemphill was very judicious in his choice of sounds to use there. It's very spare, as I'm sure you remember. And it also features, other than, I think, the desert mouse, The only other animal in the movie is certainly on Caladan, which is there's a bird call on that bluff, which we added specifically to at least create a contrast of wildlife in this lush, water and possessing planet, and Arrakis, which has none.
Yeah, you really are grounded in those locations by the soundscape as much as anything else. One of the sounds, of course, which you had to invent from scratch would have been the shield. When they're having their combat there, Gurney Halleck and Paul Atreides. And how early on did you come up with a sound like that? Because it felt to me as if the visual effects were so in sync with what I was hearing. It felt like you couldn't have added that later. It felt like it must have been a process that ran parallel.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I was going to say earlier also, I mean, we're not the only department that there is this sort of early, bringing us on early thing happening. Even the storyboard artist will have the director of photography coming and working with him. And, the VFX team will be also coming on as early as we do, giving the editor their very first iterations. So for the shield, they had developed, I think I saw just like a couple of frames of a sort of juddery effect that wasn't really developed yet, but an idea of what they were going to apply to the images. The shots are so carefully coordinated. The fight of that sort of Paul and Gurney training, which is the first time we see the shield and was the scene which we used to kind of, develop the shield on. It's so carefully coordinated. And the idea for Mark and I to think of putting like a kind of omnipresent force field sound around the user, kind of
very cliche-ish.
We really didn't want to go there, and also visually that would lock visual effects into having to see something kind of glowing around them the whole time or something, and that would really get in the way of the beautiful choreography and all of the details of because they're sparring. Physically, but also verbally in little moments. So the scene has its own rhythms already, and to intrude on those rhythms or just put a blanket over it just seemed wrong. And obviously we wanted to do something more original than just, what we've heard in other movies. So we were given this very early idea of how the vibrations of the shield might look. And I was able to sort of create a very, very early pass of what I thought the shields might sound like and hand it back to them. And I think it was a little too sort of soft. The very first version was more like a kind of purring throb that just occurred when the shields felt an impact from a weapon. It was as if it's kind of the air's throbbing and the sword gets pushed back. They started using that, although kind of the note from Denis was to try to make it sound more dangerous and more unstable and more kind of glitching. It's something where we need to understand that a blade going in at the right angle, the right speed is going to get through and be able to kill someone. So it's it can repel a fast moving object, but not a slow one. So this sort of sense of it being unstable came when messing around with a sound, and it just started to glitch out and make a horrible crackling sound that normally we would go, oh no, that's an error. Luckily, Denis is always happy to embrace something that comes with the proviso of this might be a terrible idea, but have a listen anyway.
You might like them better when we do that.
Yeah, I think it helps. It helps. So yeah, we played back a much more kind of glitchy, snappy, kind of crackly shield that to me made sense as a more kind of weaponized sound. Denis liked it, and then we kind of edited that sound into the patches where we thought it should, where the shield's activating. That went back to the VFX department, who animated the vibration and the particles of the shields to that sound.
Very cool.
Poetry in the background.
Yeah. It's like you've hit play on your library of sounds.
Oh, that's a good one.
No, that scene works really well. You get the sense that there is still danger and there is still peril there, that the shield is doing like the best it can, but yeah, there is a vulnerability there. From the moment we see that, we understand, visually and from the sound, we understand what's going on.
Come on. Oh, man.
The slow blade penetrates the shield.
I just wondered, going quickly back to the voice, I meant to ask whether your design of the voice was late on, you said, but had that kind of been influencing how Hans Zimmer was using voices in his compositions as well, do you think?
I don't think there's a direct relationship because I don't know that Hans ever heard much of that early experimentation.
Right.
It's my understanding, Theo can comment on this more, that Hans had always had the idea to use female voices as part of the palette of his score.
I'm not sure. I know that we sent him some of the early kind of whispery cloud of witches, and that was definitely something that he was aware and where we were going to use it and the type of textures. We were also sort of sharing some of the languages that we were using with him, and I think some of those ended up in those Bene Gesserit kind of whisper chant things. I mean, quite a lot of our experiments in the voices, I think, were heard and did influence the idea of a Bene Gesserit sisterhood needing this kind of chanting and ancient ancestral vibe. It's hard to say. We did have a lot of sidebars, as it were, with Hans, sending sounds that we were developing, and he would send us the things that he was working on, especially instruments, sounds, as it were, that he was making custom instruments and vocal textures and synthesizer patches. So that was a very, another thing which Denis was very keen on, and it takes a director like Denis, asking two departments that normally work pretty separately to integrate to make something like that happen. I think it was useful. I think we definitely had a way of knowing what direction Hans was going in with certain sounds and textures and ideas, and vice versa. Also, there are certain scenes where we knew we were going to be very percussive, like with a thumper or with the running on drum sand. And I think that really helped avoid a situation where, he had developed some big percussive drum sort of chase thing for the running on the drum sound away from the worm, and then we would have to figure out how to fit these together in the mix. So there were certain things like that where a certain amount of kind of loose pre-planning happened just by sharing textures, sounds, ideas, and I think, yes, in the sense of the voice, he would have heard, as Joe Walker passed him any of the early versions of what we were doing, he would have heard the voice and been able to work on ideas that integrated with that. And sort of, I feel like we've achieved as a result this thing where we kind of, sometimes we hand off a scene where we've had cackling witchy voices inside someone's head, and just as the scene ends, we kind of dovetail into a Hans cue where he's got the sort of whispering voices, and as a result there's a really nice sort of, we never quite know who is leading our emotions. Is it the sound design? Is it the music? The Gom Jabbar scene is an example of that, where we build up all of these sort of pain tones of dentist drills and whispers and things inside Paul's head, and then there's a moment where Paul conquers the pain, looks the Reverend Mother dead in the eye, and she kind of responds with a look that says, "Who are you? Are you the Kwisatz Haderach?" And there's this change where the sound hands over to the music, and Hans's kind of Kwisatz Haderach kind of wail comes out of that moment.
I would say that one of the values of that, since Blade Runner 2049, one of the geniuses in this system that Denis likes to employ of having composers and sound designers on early, is that we're kind of mapping out some territory, and in the process informing each other about what we're doing and where those boundaries are. And Denis is very keen on blurring those boundaries. I think it's a value to him to have a track that feels more seamless. And you can only orchestrate that when we're all designing in advance and we're all kind of orchestrating. And I use that term very specifically because I don't think what Theo and I do is any different than what a musical composer does. Everything about what we do, what we create, is takes into consideration meter and time and timbre and 1,000 other metrics that you might ascribe to something musical. And in those early handoffs, we're kind of building the architecture of the soundtrack such that it doesn't wait till the final mix to find out, is all of this gelling? Is it all working together correctly? So on this sort of 20,000 foot level, Denis has very intelligently built a system for us all that allows a greater degree of cooperation and collaboration.
Yeah, I've listened to the soundtracks of Blade Runner 2049 and Dune on Tidal, like a Spotify kind of service. And a couple of moments I went, where's that bit? Oh, hang on. That isn't Hans, that's Mark and Theo and co, So it really does have that crossover that you don't know where the sound effects finish and the music begins. And
I've had more experience maybe as a composer than I have as a sound designer, and I've always the thing that's always bugged me the most is that moment of transition into a score cue. It's like I've always worked very, very hard to find ways that score comes in without you noticing it, or in some way it almost seems to evolve out of a scene. And maybe that's why I'm not big into sort of musicals in general on film. It's always just snapped me out of the picture the second that music kicks in and people are singing. I don't know. That's like a very different thing. But you could say that like. Similarly, when a cue comes into a cue of music comes into a film, and it comes in rather suddenly, you're aware of it and you think, oh, like what is it they're wanting me to feel with this music that's coming in here? I mean, if it creeps in on you or it seems to sort of somehow evolve out of the sound that you thought was the background, you may not even notice it. It moves in by stealth, and then it's inside your head without you even realizing that something has shifted in what you're listening to. And
it's a very subtle bit of manipulation when you think about it on Denis' part, because arguably part of the job of a good filmmaker is to get the audience to suspend disbelief. And there is a little film critic in every single person who goes to see a movie whose subconscious brain is saying, dialogue, music, sound effects, we're subconsciously analyzing. By erasing those borders, Denis allows you to sort of step away from that critic in your brain and just enjoy the narrative.
I'd argue that sound design is more of a subconscious thing for most moviegoers. You tend not to be thinking so much about the sound as you are about the music. When there's a piece of music, you might be there kind of, you're on some level, you're taking it in knowing that it's music and able to hum it after the film's gone. Whereas the sound, you kind of just accept as it could have almost just been recorded there with the film. And a lot of people I've noticed actually think that, that's how the sound is achieved for a film. So I think we get to work in this very nice twilight zone of manipulation where we're able to evoke a lot in the same way that a score is, and yet never get spotted
much more stealthy.
Never get sort of flagged as having had a manipulative effect on people's emotions or whatever.
And the beauty of sound design is that the composer has 12 notes to work with, and we have the entire panoply of sound in the universe.
Well, it was interesting that I came out of the film having seen it in the IMAX first, and my wife knew I was interviewing you guys, and she said, so how was the sound? And I said, well, this bit made me feel confused, and this bit made me feel hot, and this bit made me feel, and I was like, I don't know anything about the sound. I'm going to have to go and see it again and kind of you think of it, from a sort of critical and deconstructive point of view. So it certainly does its job. I know Denis obviously was a big fan of the books when he was a younger man, or 15-year-old, I think he said. I think it was about the same time I read it as well. Did you guys ever refer back to the book to come up with inspirations for the sounds? I'm thinking maybe like for the Ornithopter, which has evolved into something else from the book. It's more insectoid, whereas it's clearly a mechanical military beast in this film.
Well, if in terms of the Ornithopter, the answer for me is no. I read the book as a teenager and left it at that, and wanted to bring a fresh perspective to the book, unless I was in some way not honoring the book, and I haven't discovered yet that I didn't or we didn't. The ornithopters are still a very purposeful, mechanically based military craft. I mean, yes, they are insectoid, perhaps visually, but they are clearly made out of heavy metal parts that need to have an MO to make this thing function properly. So I did not refer to the book in any of the work that I did designing. I went by what I saw.
Kind of did. I'd read the book when I was much younger and forgotten it completely. Well, not forgotten all the details. And I also I'd seen the Lynch adaptation and wanted to kind of get that out of my head. Definitely didn't go back to watching that version. I felt like, other than a couple of times checking on YouTube a little clip from it, that we hadn't gone down the same road on some sound design or something.
Right.
But going back to the book was definitely, I think Mark and I get the ability to flesh out backstories sometimes. We get the ability to sort of enrich the world that you see outside of the frame of the cinema screen. And finding things in the book that were described about the city of Arakeen, finding little details of description of how the shield worked and what it would sound like. Those things were really useful. I also felt like I had to swat up on it so that I could talk to Denis about some of those things, because I knew how passionate a fan of the book he was. So I wanted to make sure that if we were adding in details that you weren't seeing on the screen, that they weren't somehow taking us further away from his interpretation of the book. Because as you say, his interpretation, and it is all interpretation, of something like the ornithopters, which are described in the book as being genetically engineered from dragonflies. You could go in a really sort of fantasy movie, kind of make them literally look like a giant dragonfly that's got some genetic engineering done to sort of make it into a half helicopter or something. Visually, if he had done that, yeah, we would be recording dragonflies and making it a very, very clear insect sound. But one of the things that Denis really wanted to do was to have his interpretation be something grounded enough that we could believe in the reality of these, things like ornithopters that don't exist in our world, therefore have, something which we're able to just go, oh, it's kind of like a helicopter. It might have beating wings rather than revolving blades, but I get it. We understand that's kind of like some serious piece of US military hardware. And so in his interpretation of exactly how those things had been adapted, there is absolutely a dragonfly there in the design. And when you see them in the distance flying through the desert, yeah, absolutely, they look like dragonflies. When you see them up close, we see the sort of the brutalist sort of shaped metallic structures that construct to the outside, the inside. We see that the blades are, they have like almost little motors that sort of hold each blade. We're able to see certain design features and go, okay, so that's where the engine is, that's where the blade's beating from. We're able to sort of construct something that, even though Mark and I made it out of bizarre kind of witch's brew of elements like beetles' wings beating and a cat purring and tent straps flapping in the wind and all of these things that bear no actual visual relation to it. We were able to construct something that felt as familiar as a serious, heavy piece of military hardware, like a helicopter, and then make variations for each house, so that the House Harkonnens have a slightly more insectoid and evil-sounding version of the. But
let me fill in there a little bit, Theo. I think one of the reasons those sounds are successful, and many of the sounds are successful in the film, is that they start life as acoustic recordings. Denis' mandate to us early on was to ground this film, a science fiction film, in some form of acoustic or organic reality. So there's sort of a filter through which we can see everything that we design. So I would argue most of the sound in the film starts life as an organic element. And there's psychological reasons why we sign off on those kinds of things quicker than we do, say, with a synthetic sound that's harder to make believable or feel as though it lives in an acoustic reality we recognize. Yeah, that was an important sort of structural approach for us. Theo and I waxed poetic often about what our design philosophy would be. And part of it revolved around this idea that it should feel like we made a documentary, that we put a boom pole out somewhere and captured ornithopters and worms and shields as if they really existed. And having that as a framework for everything we designed really helped us focus how to create sounds that weren't fantastical. I mean, we love the fantastical nature of science fiction. We're fans of it, and where a movie, say, like Star Wars, presents that kind of fantastical sonic approach, we didn't want that approach. That's a great and successful approach. I'm not throwing shade on how Star Wars sounds. I'm jealous of it. But it wasn't the right approach for this movie. This movie had to feel as though you landed on Arrakis and you walked out of your ornithopter and all those sounds were believable.
Mm. Yeah, and in a way that changing from the insectoid approach to a physical piece of hardware, we buy it more, don't we? It's not as fantastical world that's being created visually as well.
Yeah, I think that was the key thing, really, to make people believe in the world. And the more fantasy synthesized, sort of, hyper real and outlandish sounds tend to take people into a fantasy universe that's a completely different experience. So yeah, as Mark says, we were trying to do this sort of almost faking a documentary. There is, with the one exception, I think, being, and that somehow comes back to what you were saying about influence from the book. The book has such a sort of psychedelic heart, for want of a better. It's a hero's journey, or is it? Is it someone who's hearing voices in his head affected by something that that has a psychedelic property? So. And there are whole civilizations built around, the use of this thing, and all of these descriptions of the way that it smells and the way that it feels and the effects on a person. So the one area that I think we went into a fantasy as described by the book is the interior world of Paul as he has his visions, as the spice takes effect on him. Those sort of moments were something that were, it was very important, I think, to get across. For me, having remembered the things that I thought were special about the book, that sense that we need to experience the visionary world of somebody who has had such powerful visions that they believe that they could actually be some kind of chosen one, and that's a really important part of the plot going forward into the part 2 and maybe beyond.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pleased to hear that I was just saying to Mark when we lost you for a moment earlier that the box office has been good and part 2's already to be started and everything. So I couldn't have imagined what it would have been like if that was the end of the story.
No. Very disappointing.
It was a bold move there, but I'm glad it paid off. I was also listening to the hunter-seeker sound when I watched it that second time around, and it's got that slightest tiny little sound that again embodies the thing itself, but it communicates danger along with the music, of course. But it gives us this real sense of threat just by this tiny weeny sound. You almost have to kind of lean in to understand if you're hearing it correctly. How was that?
Well, let me set the context for that, and Theo can talk about the design of it. One of the reasons I think you got that feeling is that Doug Hemphill very artfully crafted the dynamics of that scene to make it very, very, very quiet, except for the very delicate sounds that we crafted for the hunter-seeker and the score as well. And so that's a real study in how dynamics shape how you feel about a scene, assuming all the elements that you have to work with in a mix are the correct ones.
That was a scene which I remember designing before we had any music for it. And I think the music does add a lot of tension. I swear I hate mosquitoes more than anyone else. I mean, I really, if I detect a mosquito in the house in the middle of the night, I'm the one who's getting up with a torch going, I'm gonna get this thing.
And you do hold your breath, don't you? When you hear one, you hold your breath and you think, well, you're trying to work out. I mean, I've been in like places like Malaysia and Myanmar, and there you're worried about mosquitoes.
Yeah, literally, that may be a death sentence in that mosquito's sting. So, one of the things that I think is the funniest about when you're kind of mosquito hunting around your apartment is that moment where you've been like, no, I've got it. Wait, where did it go? It's gone silent. And there is this brilliant moment in there where Paul is, he looks aside to see where his shield is, because that's possibly something he could use to prevent the attack. And he sees it's too far away. He's not going to be able to go and grab it without, attracting the attention of the hunter-seeker. So and it's that moment where he looks away and he looks back and the thing's gone quiet, and there's just a moment of, wait, where is it? Where is it gone?
So I remember that was a moment we also worked out with Clint. I think you had the idea, Theo, that could we just have the score also go quiet for that beat, so we get that great moment with Paul of, hang on a second.
When the score came in, that's right. When the score came in, it did kind of somewhat go over that beat, and we did find a way of just preserving that moment of silence. But I mean, the sound itself was a relatively simple thing, really, of when it appears in its little kind of its appendages kind of open out because it's come through a little sort of burn hole. I was just using the sounds of sort of knives going shing shing, but just filtering them out so that they just tiny little tiny little object. And then Joe Walker has an assistant called Mary Lukashevich who we regularly rely on for doing quick fill-ins of vocals. She has a very flexible voice, and I think in Blade Runner 2049 she provided the voice for the giant pink joy that comes at the end and as an advert. Sometimes she's just amazing at nailing something that we ask for. And there I was like, I haven't got a recording of a mosquito. That's not an easy thing to get a genuine recording of that kind of
a lot of chasing involved.
Tiny sound without, or potential sting involved.
Right.
So I asked her to sing a mosquito song, basically, to just imitate a mosquito, which she did brilliantly, and I was then able to sort of pitch it up so that it was genuinely like a tiny, tiny little mosquito pitch sound, with a few little details of how it kind of flies by. When it flies by, you can hear that it's mechanical, just adding in a few little sort of mechanical sounds. But yeah, like Mark points out, I think a scene like that works when you have a mixer who's aware of the dynamics of a tiny, tiny thing that you can barely hear, a pin drop, as it were, and at the same time, having to balance a score that is pretty present and conveying the threat of possible death. I like that. I like that hunter seeker very much, and that's something that's very, very accurately described in the books. So that was one of the little moments where I was dipping back into the book and reading the description of the sound.
And again, that as I remember, Theo, those were sounds that you had made maybe even in Budapest and survived for over a year. Those were crafted early on while filming was taking place. Yeah,
they're pretty early on. Yeah.
Going from a tiny weeny sound to what could have been a colossal sound with the worm, you chose not to go down the road of having the kind of, and I don't mean to denigrate Gary Rydstrom's work, but the T-Rex roar kind of that's become the sound for every monster since 1993. When was that decision made to go for something that wasn't?
Well, it was made after our first failure. You give us far more credit than we're due, because before we had a proper sound brief from Denis, Theo and I knew this was an important sound to design, and our early examples were much more monster-like, or I use the term Godzilla, not to denigrate the Godzilla movies, they're tremendous, but what we did not want, what we would discover is, after failing early, that this was not meant to be a moment of terror for Paul. This was Paul meeting the god of the desert, and this was meant to be a moment of reverence. And so it was incumbent upon us to really rethink that moment entirely, so much so that the early sound designs, the worm didn't say anything. When I say, meaning we didn't vocalize it. You heard the rich rustling of the baleen, and you heard a deep, dry inhale, and you heard sand trickling off the body of the worm. And that pretty much was kind of effective for some time until we got to another idea that the worm should do something, but it shouldn't be terrifying. And there might also be this other unifying factor in its relationship with the thumper. So as it happens, Dave Whitehead had the big success with the voice of the worm. Dave created what we affectionately call the gunk gunk gunks, because that's onomatopoeia for what they sound like. And the brilliance of that is that it tied together these two concepts of which came first, the sound of the worm or the lure that's meant to attract it. You know, they lived in some kind of symbiosis for millennia. And we love that kind of subconscious identification of the two. So Dave would end up making the gunk gunk gunks, and we would present them, as Theo had mentioned earlier, in a sound design review session where I think I said, "You're probably not going to like this, but," and of course, Denis, we got "I deeply love this" upon that presentation. Yeah, there we go.
That's great.
It's a thumper. Someone set off a thumper.
We talked about the voice having the most iterations out of the sounds. And I was also talking about those kind of, not easy wins as such, but ones where you didn't have to manipulate sounds too much. And I saw the story of the desert rat or desert mouse.
Desert mouse.
Desert mouse. Can you just tell me that little story as well? Because I think that's a really, really nice way to show the different extremes of sound design.
That was a great win for us because Theo and I at that time were playing around with little rodental-like sounds and manipulating them. We were taking hamsters and guinea pigs and mice and rats and things that make those cute little squeaky noises and manipulating them. And one weekend, Joe Walker, our film editor, had seen the Danny Connor video that had gone viral, 16.5 million views, of 4 abandoned baby red squirrels that made the cutest sounds in the world. And Joe wrote me texted me that weekend with a link to the Zoom video and said, "Wouldn't this be a great desert mouse?" and I looked at it and loved it and called Danny, and she thought she was being pranked or spoofed or whatever that term is by some guy in Hollywood who wants to put her sound in a big movie. I mean, I didn't really say it that way. And I don't think I used the term Hollywood either. Nonetheless, it was so perfect out of the box that what is in the movie is unadulterated, other than, I believe Theo took the original recordings, which were captured in a forest, and took out some of the background sort of ambience. There was some thick air rushing sounds that wouldn't have been appropriate for the dead quiet desert, but the vocalizations themselves are just right out of the box.
That's great that 15, 20 years ago that could never have happened. We live in a world now where we can just be sort of having half an idea of something or come across something by chance online. I was going to ask you guys as well about, because I saw it in IMAX, so I heard it in IMAX 12 and then Dolby Atmos in the second sitting, and I'm sure at some point I'm going to have it on my Sony headphones on my iPad or something. How much of a concern is it for you guys that is going to happen? You've got these multiple iterations, and what do you have to do to ensure that you get the best results for each of those different situations?
As long as the fans who wanted to see it in the cinema get to see it there, I think that's like we're hugely relieved and happy that there was a cinema release where so many people have been able to see it. And I would say, I think Mark can talk to this more than I can, but generally we design for the cinema experience. So things like the voice, which we knew is going to be something that we want people to feel inside their bodies, is something, yes, you could argue, well, that's not going to work if you're watching it on an iPhone, but to design for an iPhone would be a sin for those who come to see it in the cinema. So, we design for the cinematic experience, and then there is a process whereby we review and make slight tweaks for the different versions. So, for instance, the voice uses a slightly less deep bass impact for those of us who are watching it on stereo on a TV or a device, just simply because otherwise it's not going to be heard. It's going to be below what any speaker can reproduce.
Sure.
So yeah, Mark, take it away anyway. That's what I have to say.
Well, we want success in all formats. Theo and I, as he very rightly points out, that we're purists and we're designing for the cinema. Nonetheless, we want the home theater experience to be enjoyable. We want the device experience to be enjoyable. So that's where the expertise, again, of our recording mixers, Ron Bartlett and Doug Hemphill, come into play, because they have to now interpret this vision in a very painful process of recontextualizing a gorgeous, dynamic, full bandwidth mix and figure out a way to make it equally as compelling in a much smaller container. And that requires a great deal of art and craft to do that accurately and successfully. But I would add, though, that after working with Denis on Blade Runner, Theo, help me if I won't get the quote exactly right, but Denis referenced, as he did many times, his grandmother as an influence in how we would approach sound, because he had this concern that she might take a flight from somewhere and experience one of his movies on those crummy little headphones that you get on an airline. And he was quite aware, he's very astute sonically, that a lot of the work that we do with deep sub-frequencies and wide dynamic range was going to be lost in the mix for that version. And that was a design aesthetic that Theo and I should consider as we built the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For his grandmother.
and also, that it wouldn't be too painful for his grandmother if she was to see it in the cinema. I mean, I think that's the other the other side of it. It's we don't want something to be an unpleasant effect for anybody. And so when we're going in using something like the subwoofer, we're very, very judicious with how we use it. We really kind of kept away from using it in some of the other instances where we might, just for sort of big impacts or an explosion or something, we reserved its power just for the moments that we decided from a design perspective had a special use.
Yeah, I was wondering about that kind of potential for sound fatigue for the audience, that you're using all the tools all the time, but it certainly didn't feel like that.
I would like to add to that thought the observation that often filmmakers and people in our industry see sound design as an additive process, that what we do is to bring more sound. But in fact, sound design is not unlike editing, because editing, and the root of the word to edit is to choose. Being a good sound designer means deciding what you should hear, and sometimes that's subtractive. And that I'm just trying to sort of continue on this thought of Theo's, that our goal is to make a pleasing sonic experience, even if that means removing sound, if that means not using subwoofer, not using the sounds that we labored over for months because it's the right thing to do for a scene. That's our ultimately our charge as storytellers.
Yeah, that scene with the combat training, it felt like a lot of the sound was stripped away there, and you just heard the kind of the grunts and the groans as they're kind of fighting, and that's probably a good example of, you know, not using all of the tools that are your, you know, in your toolbox.
Do you mean the gurney pull training scene? Yeah, that's specifically one where we were put in sort of whooshes and blade sounds, you know, like, because they're
much more
fighting
Bruce Lee
blades.
like,
Yeah, and it was exactly, you know, that's what you would traditionally do. You hear every and a shing and a clang, and it's like that, they're fighting with swords. But it was Denis who was very specific in saying, the more that you hear, the more heavy the sword sounds, the more whooshes you hear, actually, the less dangerous it feels. The more that you pull those sounds away, and maybe you just have a hint of you just have a close-up breath, you make quick cuts that kind of accompany the fast-moving choreography, and suddenly it feels like, actually, if that knife goes close to you, it is going to cut you. The more kind of clang, clang, swoosh, it just feels like they're having a fun sort of play fight or something. It's a really interesting observation that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of, but absolutely he was right. As we pulled away those big, heavy, traditional sounds, it becomes more intimate. You're in there with the characters, you're right next to them, you can even hear them sharply inhale as something comes close to them, and all of these things, you focus differently. So that, again, is Denis' guidance really helping us as sound designers.
Yeah. It's amazing how you can feel the intimacy of a scene that's, you know, 5 stories high in front of you.
As I remember, what I remember from the sessions themselves, we went to version 14 of that sequence, and what I remember from version 1, which, as Theo rightly described, as a cacophony of everything you'd hear in a fight, with the whooshes and the hits and the impacts and the shings of the blades. Those 14 iterations, if you looked at it, you would see the gradual removal, every iteration of yet another component, till we got it down to what it really needed to be. And that's the genius of Denis' sort of keen ear.
So how do we make this genius of Denis proliferate into the film industry to ensure that this approach is taken each time, where they bring you guys on board from day one and all the way through to
That's a very interesting point, because I mean, a lot of the time when we talk about sort of, we were brought on early, people are like, oh well, guess you had a big budget then, sort of. And there is, you know, to some extent, that's probably the reason that Denis' early films couldn't do that. You know, budgetary reasons. We're post-production. What do you mean start them during production? It's post-production. So, you know, to an extent, his clout as a director, let's say, and the studio's willingness to let us do that is one reason why we did it. And yet it was Joe Walker who pointed out the other day, as we were talking about this, that in fact it saved money, because a VFX shot is considerably more expensive than hiring a couple of sound designers for a few weeks. You know, it can run into the millions, even certainly hundreds of thousands. And there were moments where they were planning a large VFX sequence of a worm bursting through, you know, a sand dune, and, you know, you'd see the side of the worm, you'd see the sand crashing down. That would be intended as, like, I think he said, 25-second sequence, a shot that would have had to have been built by the VFX team. And when I say team, that's, you know, teams, lots and lots of people working for weeks.
Yeah, you see the credits go by on VFX.
Yeah, exactly. That's all of those credits.
Yeah.
And, you know, the cost of being able to say, actually, the sound designers have provided us with a sound, and now that we hear it rumbling before we see it, we actually only want to see it breach for a few seconds. So that VFX shot, instead of being 20-something seconds, maybe we just need it to be 3.5 seconds of that actual shot of it bursting through the sand dune. The rest of it's going to be done by the sound. And so, you know, a moment like that can save a production hundreds of thousands, whereas, you know, bringing on a couple of sound designers a little bit earlier on absolutely doesn't cost anything like that. So you could make the argument, I think, if you're saying, how do we proliferate this idea into other filmmakers' work, that when you're working with multiple elements of VFX sound, and you're creating something you know, that doesn't exist in the real world, the planning of exactly how much VFX you need can be really informed by the sound and the editor figuring it out before they've even hired the teams to make that VFX shot. Money can be saved.
Yeah. Well, all the while it's in the cinema, I'll be going back to experience it. I'm dragging a few friends to the IMAX next week, who are umming and ahhing about it. Oh, but it's on HBO Max, it'll be on Netflix soon. It's like, no.
Don't indulge that, please.
Let's go to the cinema. Yeah, and I always like to talk to people whose work I've admired, and I just want to say thanks for your work. I thought it was excellent and mind-blowing and inspirational. So from all of us sitting on this side of the screen, really appreciate your work and your effort, and I really appreciate you giving your time today.
Wow, that's so lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
So glad you enjoyed the sound so much.
Yeah, likewise.
Thanks, guys. That was awesome.
Okay.
Cheers.
Right.
You know how we were saying about how sound immerses you into a world? I feel like I was immersed in your world for a little moment there, Theo.
Yes, you were.
It was my world 5 years ago.
Really? Yeah, so you know it well. Very realistic.
Theo, you better be recording those baby sounds. Those are just priceless sounds.
I am. I'm building up a library.
If you need any for Zoom calls, I'm your man. Guys, appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jamie.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation there with sound designers Theo Green and Mark Mangini. I had an absolute blast talking to those two guys. I'm very much looking forward to hearing more of their Dune work in 2023 now that the part 2 has been confirmed. A big thanks to Emily Erskine of Erskine PR for arranging this interview, and thanks, of course, to both Theo and Mark for their time and their excellent work. Thanks as always to my friend Michael Hewitt-Brown of MB Music, who created the theme for this podcast. Contact Michael at embemusic.co.uk if you'd like some music for your project. He's great to work with, Mike. He's good fun and very professional as well, a very talented man. And finally, thanks to my wife for continuing to be amazing and supporting me in everything I do, encouraging me along the way with my podcast project here. I couldn't do it without your help and support and your love, so thank you. Coming soon on the Filmumentaries podcast, I hope to pin down a date with composer Daniel Pemberton soon. Looks like it's going to be January. Looking forward to that one. I also have a couple of movie book authors lined up, as well as director John Spira, who made Elstree 1976 and has also made a documentary about stuntmen, which I watched recently, which was great fun. I'm hoping to talk to all of them in the coming weeks. Also, rather excitingly, I've been chatting to a very prominent and well-respected costume designer. She is keen and is checking her schedule to find time that works because she's about to delve into a big project herself. I've also just contacted Garrett Brown to see if he can give an hour or two. Garrett and I had previously had a nice email exchange back in 2016 when I was doing some of my short video projects. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to do it then, and I was supposed to get back in touch with him in 2018, 2019. And I didn't. If you don't know who Garrett Brown is, he's the guy that invented the Steadicam, which of course was shown off really in The Shining. There were films before that where it was used, but The Shining was the one that everybody thinks of. Anyway, I'm hoping that Garrett's going to get back in touch and hopefully have him on the podcast soon. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so once again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
Spice in the tent.